inverted roller coasters. In the early 1990s, B&M made a name for themselves by releasing Batman the Ride, the world's first coaster under the track to feature inversions. Since then, the Invert has become one of their most famous models, and in my opinion, their best. Very recently, I just rode Montu, who many consider to be the best invert in North America, and I figured it was a good time to, come together and maybe do a little tier list of all the inverts that I've been on. This is only going to include the 11 inverts that I've been on, active or defunct, so nothing outside of America, and there are going to be a couple inverts that I have not been to in the States, but besides like Flight Deck at California's Great America, that's really the only major one I'm missing. I'm missing Patriot at Worlds of Fun, but I think I'm okay doing this tier list without going to Worlds of Fun to ride Patriot. I have some pretty strong and trend-bucking opinions on several inverts, as you'll see soon in the video, so hop in, I hope you enjoy the ride. Together, we are going to rank the B&M inverts in North America. So I thought of a few different ways of doing this. I don't want to start from the bottom and go to the top, because that's kind of boring, so what I ended up doing is alphabetical order. So we're going to start from the A's, end with the Z's, but since I did just ride Montu, I kind of want to give that ride a little mini review, so I'm going to save Montu for the end. And one more thing, I thought about ranking these in the tier list based on kind of where they fall in my rankings, but here's the thing though, B&M inverts are good rides. The worst B&M invert out there is at its best a 7 out of 10, which is puts it above a lot of roller coasters in my rankings. So I decided to not rank it based on where it comes in my rankings. Instead, I'm going to tier them relative to each other. So, the best invert in the world is going to be S tier, but the worst invert out there is going to be D or even F tier. Like I said, I haven't been on Patriot at Worlds of Fun, but, let's say that a D tier would be a Patriot, and an S tier would be, well, you're going to have to find out. First up is Afterburn at Carowinds. Originally opening when the park was called Paramount's Carowinds over sometime in the 2000s, Afterburn is considered by a lot of enthusiasts to be in the top tier of B&M inverts. And it's not hard to see why, just judging by the fact that it has a bat wing, which, as we've discussed before, is the greatest inversion ever made. There's a lot more that Afterburn's layout offers. 5, I think, maybe 6 inversions throughout its pretty good paced layout. And a lot of people compliment Afterburn for really bringing on the force. So, where do you guys think that I put Afterburn? Well, not to start things off with a hot take, but I think Afterburn's a little bit mid, actually. It's going right into the B tier. And I have a couple reasons for this. First off, it's weirdly paced. A lot of people say Afterburn has great pacing, but it has 2 very noticeable dead spots throughout the ride. The first being the Immelman. Usually I don't like Immelmans to begin with. Afterburn has to have the weakest Immelman out there. It pulls absolutely no force and has no whip or airtime coming out of the top. Then after the Batwing, you have that really weird, bizarre airtime hill afterwards that has to go over the lift and get back towards the station. This offers literally nothing. No forces, no really exciting views, nothing like that. And I thought it was a bit of a buzzkill after the Batwing. Let's talk about that Batwing too. Of the Batwings I've experienced, it's definitely the worst Batwing, but that's like saying it's, I don't know, the worst giant chunk of gold that you found in the river. The Batwing is still amazing, but it doesn't have the amazing hang time and whip that Viper's does, and it lacks the sheer power and force that Montu's does, so it does come up in the rear. I mean, I am being nitpicky here, of course that's the point of these tier lists, but Afterburn is still also a very solid ride at the end of the day. I don't think it's in the elite tier. It's definitely on the good side of B&M inverts, but, I was left wanting a little bit more, especially given its reputation. Moving on from Afterburn to Busch Gardens Williamsburg's Alpengeist. Alpengeist is a coaster I hold near and dear to my heart because it was my first inverted roller coaster, and it has had a large impression in my memory since my childhood. Alpe was kind of the first big boy roller coaster I ever got to go on after the Big Bad Wolf and the Loch Ness Monster. This thing is absolutely huge. It towers at near hypercoaster heights, like you couldn't go an extra 5 feet to get a hyper invert. Come on. This thing absolutely towers over the rest of the B&M inverts with massive inversions, especially in the first half. and a mid-course break run that, we'll talk about that in a little bit, that leads to a more traditional second half featuring a post-mid-course 0G roll, a corkscrew, and some nice snowy theming as you make your way back to the station. So for me, Alpengeist, and this might also be a hot take, A tier. A lot of people kind of shit-talk Alpengeist, especially recently, and I understand where they're coming from, because a lot of the ride's momentum just gets absolutely destroyed by that mid-course trim. And I can't disagree. It's really terrible. It kind of hurts when you go into that trim and you get just slammed to a stop. I rode Alpi a lot in my childhood days when the mid-course trim did not hit, and oh my god, that thing was fucking insane. I will do anything for Busch Gardens to stop trimming the hell out of Alpengeist and letting it tear through that second half the way it did in the front half. But I'm not ranking Alpengeist based on memories here. Even in its semi-neutered state, I think Alpengeist is one of the best inverts out there. It just brings so much force, especially in the first half. Like, that big-ass vertical loop, you think it's not going to have any force to it because it's so huge, but it still manages to crush your skull in as you go through. And of course, I don't need to talk about the Cobra roll, right? Because everyone knows how insanely whippy that Cobra roll is. It's one of the best Cobra rolls out there. Yeah, after the mid-course, it does hurt a little, but it's still fun. The 0G roll and the corkscrew still offer decent force, and I do really like the snow theming at the end. Overall, the sheer ferocity of Alpi's first half, and the speed, which you can really feel throughout the entire first half. Like, this thing hauls. All that together makes Alpengeist one of the best inverts out there, even almost 30 years after its original opening. So, next up we have the newest B&M invert out there, at least in the US. We have Banshee at Kings Island. Now, Banshee at Kings Island is a much different beast from the rest of the B&M inverts here. It's made much later, and so it doesn't have the original trains with the over-the-shoulder restraints that kind of come up near your ears, replaced completely with vest restraints. The pre-drop is gone, and the elements are a lot less snappy and more drawn out, but Banshee, don't get me wrong, definitely brings the force. And a lot of people talk about just how insane that first drop is, so we can't forget about that. So, where do I think the new school B&M falls in comparison to the other inverts? Low. I was legitimately excited to ride Banshee when I first got to Kings Island because it's like such a unique invert compared to the rest, but I was pretty disappointed by the ride experience. You know, I've always been a proponent of like old school B&M. I know it's kind of a meme, but it is really true. The older school, like 90s B&Ms, really do have a lot more whip to them than a lot of the newer rides do. Overall, the Banshee ride experience just kind of fell flat for me. It's not the restraints, though. I want to state that right away. It is not the restraints. I did not have a problem with the restraints. Like, I thought they were fine. I thought they were pretty much equal to the B&M over the shoulders. Like, nice. I don't really care about the vest restraints. It's totally fine. Despite the vest, Banshee somehow manages to be the most uncomfortable invert out there. Also, despite the fact that it's like the newest by a considerable margin, it has a dull rattle across the entire ride course, which is like really shocking for a ride that opened up like in the 2010s. But I mean, I don't really care about that sort of thing that much. Like, yeah, it hurts the ride experience, but I love old arrows. Obviously, I can take some pain. The real problem with Banshee is the force. It just doesn't have much of it. Like, yeah, it pulls good positives, but even compared to the older inverts, like, it doesn't pull that great positives, except for the finale, which is amazing. Like that hang time filled roll, which leads into that final helix. The final helix totally catches you off guard because it absolutely pulverizes you. And it's a real shock compared to the rest of the ride, which feels very floaty and just not super strong. Like even the pretzel knot. Like the pretzel knot's basically a bat wing, and so you would think I would love it. Don't get me wrong, I do like it. But compared to like the other bat wings that I've experienced, like it just doesn't carry the force that I expected from it. The first drop too, like I tried the wing seats in the back like everyone said, and I was just kind of underwhelmed. Like it wasn't that great of a first drop. Like one of the better invert first drops out there, but again, that's not saying very much. I really love the dive loop. I really love the loop that wraps around the lift hill. I love the pretzel knot, and I love the finale. It's great. The whole layout is great, but it just doesn't have that power, that little X factor, that whippiness that I expect from a B&M invert. And that's why it's down in the D tier. Now, like I mentioned before, this does not mean it's a bad ride. This just means it's my least favorite invert. It still comes in at like a 7 out of 10, so don't get too mad about this. I love you, Kings Island. Please open the bat next time I come. Please, please, I just want to ride the bat. From the newest invert to the oldest, we're taking it old school now with Batman the Ride. Yes, the original, the OG B&M invert is up next, and it's crazy to believe this ride is over 30 years old now. Well, this ride being the first ride, of course. There are like 13 Batman the Ride clones out there, and no, I've not ridden nearly close to all of them, and no, I'm not going to rank them individually, but I've ridden a couple, and I think I have pretty good opinions on how Batman goes, just because I grew up so close to Great Adventure, and I've been riding my own Batman clone for decades now. And now it's time to see where Batman falls, and it falls squarely in the B tier. B for Batman. Isn't that funny? It's pretty funny. The more time goes by, the more I realize how much B&M kind of nailed it right at the very beginning. Batman is a tour de force, and by force, I mean force. Like, it still remains one of the most forceful inverts out there, even with its relatively basic and very short layout. And that's the main reason why it's not higher up here. It's relatively small, it only has 5 inversions, and the ride is over in a flash. Some of the larger inverts, however, do end up lower than Batman on this list. That's just because they don't bring the sheer ferocity that Batman really brings. That first loop is so whippy every single time, even on cold days. It's absolutely wild. Suffice to say, the 0G roll is good too, as is the second loop. And those corkscrew, like, not corkscrew thingies, wingovers I think they're called, those things are awesome. Especially if you're sitting in a back wing seat, which I'd recommend doing for every single invert on this list. Those wingovers just whip you over, and it's an incredibly insane sensation that's matched by very few inverts. Batman's been cloned so many times that a lot of enthusiasts are just kind of tired of the layout, which is understandable, but let's not forget how iconic this ride is, not just for Six Flags, but for B&M and the coaster world as a whole. Without Batman the Ride, we wouldn't have any of the modern inverting machines that we have today. And even though it's the original, even though it's kind of basic and cloned to death, Batman still holds up really well. Which is a good thing, because there are so many of these things all around the world. Moving on from Batman, we have a bit of a sad story to tell. Yes, I'm talking about the story of the dueling dragons. Fire and ice, man, these things bring me back. Besides Busch Gardens Williamsburg, the parks that we frequented a lot when I was a kid were Disney and Universal, and I was there in 1999 when Islands of Adventure opened up for the first time. I still have the original brochure from 1999, which is sick, and probably worth a lot of money, so if somebody wants to buy it in the comments, let me know. I'm poor. Opening up with the park in 1999, the Dueling Dragons were a sight to behold, truly. Not only were they massive B&M inverts stacked right next to each other, but they literally dueled. They weren't like a Gemini or like a Lightning Racers or something. They didn't just run side by side the entire time, but no. There were multiple points during the ride where the dueling dragons came within feet of each other, seeming like they're rushing head on. I've had the privilege of getting countless rides on the dragons over the years, enough that I vividly remember both rides, up to some points. And I'm lucky enough to have gotten many duels on both sides, having ridden them both as the original Fire and Ice before the Dragon Challenge thing came along. So, I definitely have a bit of a sentimental attachment to these rides, but I'll try to be objective. Let's see. Where do the dragons fall? We'll start with Fire. Fire lands in the A tier. It's still a really good invert, even without any sentimentality attached, it was a powerful, great ride. Even when it wasn't dueling, the near misses with the track on ice were absolutely awesome. Of course, I don't really like Immelmans, and there are 2 Immelmans in this ride, but, Fire did have the advantage of that really cool airtime hill. It also did have a nicer drop than Ice, which I'll definitely give it the edge on that. And it doesn't kind of meander at the end as much as Ice did. It was definitely neutered, much like Ice was when they did stop dueling, but I understand why Universal made a decision to do that, given that everyone started carrying cell phones and those are basically projectile missiles when you're traveling head-on at 60 miles an hour towards another train. But man, if you haven't experienced the sensation of dueling dragons when it dueled, it really did live up to the hype. It was a magical experience. It's a little hard for me to say just because it's been so long. Maybe this does deserve an S tier. Maybe it is even more forceful than I remember it. I can't really tell, and no one can tell now because these rides have been defunct for almost a decade now. But the Dueling Dragons really were something very special, and that carries on to ice. As you can see, I also put ice in the A tier. Now a lot of people say that they preferred fire over ice. I think I was just a weird contrarian little kid, and I actually preferred ice over fire. I think ice kind of had the better inversions. Obviously the weaker first drop, and it kind of meanders at the end, but it did bring plenty of force throughout its entire layout. A lot of what I said about fire kind of applies to ice here. Like, the dueling was an absolutely magical thing, and it was so cool. It was whippy, it was forceful, it had a great aesthetic. I really loved the lightning blue track, it looked so cool. And, you know, just a big rest in peace to these two dragons. They really deserve all the praise that they get. And every time I go to Universal, I miss them. We're rounding out the trilogy, quadrilogy, quintrilogy, if you consider Alpengeist. We're rounding out the trilogy of B&M inverts that I basically grew up with the Great Bear at Hershey Park. As you can imagine, growing up near New York, Hershey Park wasn't very far from us, and we took many trips there. The Great Bear was one of my favorite rides as a kid, and probably my favorite ride at Hershey Park for a very long time. Compared to the other inverts, Great Bear is just weird. Like, there's a lot of really weird layout concessions that the designers had to make to basically cram this ride into the middle of the park, going over a comet, going over Super Duper Looper. In a way, it makes Great Bear unique, and I'm kind of happy they did it as janky and weird as they have. So, where does Great Bear land? Great Bear lands in the A tier. I'm kind of surprised at how much I've grown to love the Great Bear, honestly. Like, it kind of took me by surprise. Because I did love this ride a lot as a kid, but as I grew older and kind of went to different parks, I fell out of love with the Great Bear a little bit. I thought, you know, the layout's kind of weird, there's not many inversions, there's a lot of dead spots, but I recently went to an ACE event last year at Hershey Park where we got night ERT on Great Bear, and my god, this ride is insane. Even compared to the other, like, very forceful inverts out there, like, Great Bear might be one of the most forceful and one of the whippiest. And that starts right off the lift hill as you do that really weird helix thing that pulls shockingly strong Gs. And it leads into a first drop because you have a little bit of speed. You actually get some airtime in the back rows. It's a really cool sensation. Well, that's just the starter for the awesome ride experience that's coming. The loop just, like, rips your face off. And the 0G roll has to be the most violent 0G roll I've ever experienced. You feel like you're getting just tossed around in a washing machine as you get whipped from side to side through that incredible 0G roll. Then you get a nice pop of airtime depending where you are on the train, going into that weird section over the hollow. And yeah, there's straight track there, but it's kind of hilarious. If you notice, B&M couldn't put the supports in the middle of the creek, so all the supports for Great Bear are on the side of the river right by Super Duper Looper, which really limited how B&M could build the track. But then, once it goes past Super Duper Looper, you explode into an amazing corkscrew. That's one of the best B&M invert corkscrews out there, and that's saying a lot, because the corkscrews on B&M inverts are amazing. The ride kind of dies after that, but it's okay because the ride's, like, over. You know, Great Bear is short, it's quirky, it's over in a flash, there's a lot of weird straight track, but it has a lot of character to it. Because it's so weird, it kind of wedges itself in your head, and it really makes the elements that do hit, which is basically everything that isn't the straight track, really stand out. So I've become a Great Bear stan again. I think it's one of the best B&M inverts out there, despite, or maybe because of, its many quirks, and the incredible force that it brings. Okay, now we're finally talking about an invert that I did not ride a bunch as a child, and we're at Cedar Point to talk about Raptor. Raptor was kind of the first big scale invert out there, you know, after the Batman the Ride clones and Flight Deck, which is, you know, bigger than a Batman clone, but it's still a pretty short and small layout. Raptor was kind of the first ride to really supersize the B&M invert layout. You know, supersize is probably not the best word to describe it here. It's absolutely dwarfed by Alpengeist and probably, like, even Montu, but the elements are definitely a lot bigger than a Batman clone. You can definitely feel it. That said, where do I think Raptor at Cedar Point lands? A tier, baby. In fact, I think Raptor is one of the best B&M inverts out there. It's really good. It combines the forcefulness of a Bat clone, but it brings just a little bit more of everything. A little bit more height, a little bit more whip, a little bit more inversions. Literally, there's, you know, more inversions. a little bit more of a complete ride experience, ending things off with that nice helix. Don't get me wrong, Raptor definitely has some points where it's just meandering and going around, but it's a lot less noticeable than Batman Clone, for example. The highlight's probably the Cobra roll. Much like Alpengeist, Raptor's Cobra roll absolutely slaps. Like, it's so violent, the transition from the half loop into the corkscrew, that it does kind of headbang, which is crazy for a B&M, but like, I don't mind that because it's so forceful and the rest of the ride is really smooth. Raptor just has a lot of snap to it. Like, if you ever sat in the back row on the right side, you know what I'm talking about. Because that first drop, it unbanks really sharply into a straight as you go into the first loop. And you get a legitimate pop of airtime as you like kind of whip back to the side. It's a really cool feeling and sensation. And of course, the loop, the 0G roll, the corkscrews, everything else hits, especially the back half when the trims are off. And when I've been to Cedar Point, I've almost never had the trims on, so it's never been a problem for me. People talk about that final helix being a leg crusher, and I kind of agree. It's strong. I don't think it's the strongest out there. I think that the Banshee helix is actually stronger, which is the one thing I will give Banshee over Raptor in the Battle of the Ohio Inverts. But yeah, Raptor tries to rip your face off, and I would not have it any other way. Moving now from Ohio all the way to the west coast of California, we're talking about Silver Bullet. Silver Bullet is one of the newer B&M inverts out there, and I was actually kind of surprised by that. I thought it was older than it actually is. It's like newer than Talon. Did you know that? I didn't know that. Silver Bullet's a weird ride, just kind of like Great Bear is, because it's been shoehorned into the middle of Knott's Berry Farm, which just has no room to begin with. And that leads to that absolutely hilarious first drop, which is like a 20-degree angle of ascent maybe, and all the crazy flyovers and interactions with different rides as well as park guests throughout. I didn't get to Knott's till this year, so it was my first time experiencing Silver Bullet, but thankfully we went on a dead-ish day and I got a lot of rides on this B&M invert. So, where does Silver Bullet fall? I'm gonna give Silver Bullet a B. And I feel a little bad about this because it's very much on the cusp between B and A tier, but we're ranking relative to other inverts, and I think compared to the inverts above it, it is weaker, but it's still a really strong ride. Like I said before, I was surprised at how new this invert is because it feels more old school than like Talon does, for example. There's a lot of force on this ride, especially with the first loop, the corkscrew, and the final helix, which I think basically matches Raptor in intensity, and it's a great way to end the ride, especially with that aesthetic of going around the fountain. It's really cool. But the quirky aspects of Silver Bullet are what really make it good. Like, let's talk about that overbank after the first loop. If you sit in the back row on the right side, I think, you get an absolutely bizarre and really good long, sustained floater airtime experience as you go over that overbank and kind of dive right down to go into the Cobra roll. The Cobra roll is like nothing really to write home about, but the interaction with the front gate is really cool. Yes, the first drop isn't great, but it's kind of hilarious. Like, I find it really funny just how shallow the angle is, and because of how tight the turn radius is, you actually pull a decent amount of positive Gs, especially if you're sitting in the back row, so it's not all terrible. It's a really good ride, and it definitely deserves its place in the B tier, maybe even the A tier, but I'm gonna leave it where it is right now, just because the other inverts ahead of it are stronger. And now we've arrived at Talon at Dorney Park. Talon has become my home invert / Batman the ride ever since I moved to Philadelphia a few years ago, and I've spent a lot of time at Dorney lately just because it's, really easy to get to for me. Dorney's like never crowded. I love it. Great park, you should go visit it. But we're not here to talk about Dorney, we're here to talk about Dorney Park's invert. Talon is one of the newest inverts out there, and it's also one of the most unique. It starts off very standard with the twisting drop, the loop, the 0G roll, the immelman. It has a really cool middle and ending section where it kind of dives down into some foliage and shrubbery and whips through a corkscrew before ending things off with a final helix that goes like right in front of a bunch of guests and offers a really cool visual spectacle. And it has a really kick-ass paint scheme. Like, I think Talon looks sick. So, where does Talon fall? Unfortunately, Talon does fall into the C tier. I'm sorry to say because, again, it's my home park invert and I've gotten many rides in it, and I do like this ride, but it just doesn't stack up when compared to some of the older inverts. Like, it's not as dramatic as Banshee, and Talon has more of an excuse because it's a much smaller ride than Banshee is, so it's more understandable that it's not going to be as whippy. It just feels like every single element just is missing something a little bit. Like, the loop is good, but it doesn't have that feeling in the back row where you like kind of get to the top and you get dragged through like on a lot of the really good inverts. The 0G roll just doesn't have the same out of control sensation some of the other inverts do. And the Immelmann does provide like a weird thing of airtime and float when you're in the back, but not much force besides that. I will say the layout is really cool. I really like the final corkscrew and the helix, but the helix is alright. A lot of rides further up on this list do offer stronger final helixes, and Talon does have a nice like pop of airtime like going into the brakes that a lot of the other inverts don't have, but it's just not as whippy and forceful as I really want it to be. Which is a shame, because I do think it's a really cool ride, and I do think it's slept on. Just compared to some of its brothers, especially its older brethren, it really can't stack up. And finally, that leaves us with our last invert, and this is the invert that I most recently rode. We're talking, of course, about Great White at Six Flags Fiesta Texas. We're talking, of course, about Montu at Busch Gardens Tampa. And boy, I have had a connection to this ride for the longest time. Back in the 90s, I had a VHS tape, and yes, I'm dating myself here, but I had a VHS roller coaster tape that talked about some of the biggest coasters in the world around that time. And on this tape was a bunch of rides like, Goliath at Six Flags Magic Mountain, so I've always had an obsession with Goliath at Magic Mountain, even though it's not a great ride. But in addition to Goliath and a bunch of other rides, there was Montu.
A Bolliger and Mabillard design opened to the public in the new Egypt section of the park, May of 1996. As of its completion, it is the world's tallest and longest inverted steel roller coaster, and it has a whole host of first-of-a-kind elements. The largest vertical loop at 104 feet, a 60-foot vertical loop half buried in a trench, and the Immelmann, an inverse diving loop named after a German stunt pilot. Enjoy the ride.
And for decades, I would go down to Disney World, I would go down to Universal, I would go to Islands of Adventure. I even went to SeaWorld Orlando once, but we never once set foot in Busch Gardens Tampa until about a week ago, when I finally got the chance to go with my brother and my cousins. I'm so happy I finally had the chance to slay my white whale out there. Actually, I showed up to the park and Montu was closed, like it was on the closed ride list, and I nearly had a panic attack because it was basically the reason I wanted to go to BGT, like in the first place. Thankfully, later in the day, Montu did end up opening up, and I got a chance to get 2 rides on it before the park kind of closed down due to rain. A lot of people say that Montu is the greatest B&M invert in the United States, if not the world. And where do I think Montu falls? All of those people are completely right. Montu is S tier. Montu is amazing. Oh my god, this is by far the best B&M invert out there. I know I kind of said, like, right after I wrote it, that, like, Montu, like, absolutely shits on every other B&M invert, and I wouldn't go that far. Yes, Montu is definitely the best B&M invert, but, like, Raptor, like, is pretty close behind. So, I got 2 rides, one in the back, one in the front. Well, the second one was in row 2, both in wing seats, so I got a pretty good idea of how the ride runs. You start out, like, going out of the station, doing this little dip. I really wish there was that crocodile exhibit that was still there, that was apparently there when the ride first opened. That would have been so cool. You go up the left hill, you get this beautiful view of the parking lot, and then you turn around and turn left into your first drop. The first drop is really nothing to write home about, but like I said, that's par of the course for many B&M inverts. But then you go into the first loop, and the first loop is very solid. I would say it's not the best B&M invert loop out there. In fact, I think Batman probably has the best B&M invert loop, but it's very close to the top. It's forceful, and it does have that great dragging sensation if you're sitting in the back row, or in the front row where you get pushed through half of the inversion. It's really cool. It's not too tall for its own good. I like it. But then you dive into a trench, the first of many trenches, and you go up into the Immelmann. And maybe it's just the sensation of speed you get from going through the trench, but that Immelmann pulled way stronger positives than almost every other Immelmann I've been on. The pullout from the Immelmann is like legitimately strong, and it feels like your legs are kind of turning into jelly, which is the sensation I'm looking for in a B&M invert, where you kind of whip out top and you do get this nice little thing of airtime, especially if you're sitting in the back. This leads into the 0G roll, which is good. Okay, great. Great Bears is better, but it's still very good. But all of that, the entire beginning of the ride, is just a preparation, an appetizer, for the highlight of Montu, which is that glorious Batwing. Oh my god, it is so good. I expected more from Afterburn's Batwing, so I expected a great, if not like world-changing experience from Montu's, but No, no. Immediately, as soon as I sailed through that Batwing, you get good forces like going up the corkscrew, but about halfway up the corkscrew, especially if you're sitting in the back row, you get ferociously yanked over the top of the half loop and dive into the trench. The whip is absolutely insane. The whip rivals Viper's, which is amazing to say because Viper has 7-car trains with like, you know, the 2 rows of 2s, so the train's almost twice as long as Montu's. And somehow Montu almost provides the exact same amount of whip. And I don't usually like gray out or black out on rides, but I was definitely feeling it through this Batwing on Montu. It's not as good in the front, like, you know, the corkscrew turn feels a little bit limp, but once you get into the trench, my god, the forces are absolutely insane in the front. And those forces carry through the second half of the Batwing, which leads into the mid-course brake run. Now, the mid-course is a mid-course, it did hit, whatever, but I was surprised to say that the drop out of the mid-course was really good. Like, it banks really suddenly and aggressively before you dive into a trench for the second vertical loop. And I wasn't expecting it at all. It really caught me off guard. I kind of got yanked to the side. You know when you're riding a ride that has a really good drop off the mid-course and that ride isn't either Ghost Rider or like some sort of hyper? Like, you know you have a good ride. And the second half is really made by those trenches. Like, the loop halfway in the ground is absolutely awesome. It feels kind of like a Batman loop. Like, it's really tight and it's definitely slower than the first loop and doesn't bring as much force, but the whip is absolutely awesome just because the inversion is so tight. You then come out of the vertical loop and you go through what I would say is the worst part of the ride, this weird dead section, this 270-degree turn. You have to get over the train tracks and you just kind of meander through the layout. And it's definitely my one main qualm with Montu and probably what's stopping it from not being my favorite looper in the world. And it's over in a short enough time as you dive into another trench and go into the corkscrew. And I thought that Batman the Ride was the gold standard by which you judge corkscrews. No, I was wrong. Montu has by far the best corkscrew of any roller coaster out there, not just the B&M Invert. The whip is absolutely insane. Like, it feels borderline illegal. Like, I don't understand how I didn't get off this ride with like a terrible headache because I expected with this insane whip that I'd be banging my head all over the place, but no. Montu's comfortable, Montu's fine, Montu's smooth even after almost 30 years of operation. You finish this insane corkscrew and you go back up into the station and like, you barely have time to catch your breath throughout the whole ride. It just absolutely blew me away. And Montu was the ride that I was like, you know, dreaming of in the days after going to Busch Gardens Tampa. I came very close and wrestled with myself for a while of whether or not I wanted to put Montu over my baby, my favorite Viper at Six Flags Magic Mountain. But in the end, Viper, I think, just pips it out because, believe it or not, Viper actually is even more forceful than Montu is, and it has kind of more character just because of the fact that, you know, it's an old arrow and I love old arrows. That said, Montu is my 17 right now out of 180 credits. It's really high. It's a 9 out of 10, and it's the only B&M not named Fury or Diamondback to make it into the 9, so you could tell that I really thought Montu was a special ride. So that's it. That's my invert tier list. As you can tell, I was very impressed by Montu. But there are a lot of great B&M inverts out there, and I just want to end this again with a reminder. This is relative to other inverts. All of these rides are really solid. Even the lowest, Banshee at Kings Island, is a 7 out of 10 in my book, and the B&M invert model is one of the best out there. They're great rides, they put B&M on the map, and deservedly so. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this list. Like I said, it's not totally complete. I am missing a couple of B&M inverts out there, but I think I've ridden enough at this point to do a good enough tier list of all the major B&M inverts. I'm so sorry, Flight Deck. I'll get to you maybe eventually if the park doesn't close. If you enjoy these tier lists, I have a couple more out there for inversions as well as roller coaster restraints. If you enjoy the more nerdy side of things, I do my coaster crash courses, which really delve into the engineering of roller coasters. And if you're in the mood for some memes, I have plenty of those too. Thanks so much for watching. If you made it this long, please give the video a like. Please subscribe to the channel. It really helps for a small channel such as myself who's like really trying to break ground in kind of the crowded YouTube market. And all of the comments and all the support I've gotten from all of you has been so encouraging and really keeps me making these videos. So thank you so much. Enjoy yourselves, and I hope you find yourself in a good B&M invert sometime soon.